It started when I moved into the building a few months ago. The rent was cheap, and the location was convenient. It was nothing special, just another apartment in a line of identical units. The walls were thin, but it was quiet enough. I worked long hours, so I didn't spend much time there anyway. I never paid much attention to my neighbors. Most of them were friendly but distant, the kind of people who'd nod at you in passing, but wouldn't stop to chat. That was fine with me. I liked my privacy. But then the knocking began. The first time it happened, it was almost 1 a.m. I'd been drifting in and out of sleep when I heard it. 3 knocks, spaced just far enough apart to make me wonder if I'd imagined it. At first, I thought it might have been the old pipes in the building. I knew they clanged and groaned sometimes, but this was different. This was deliberate. I sat up in bed, listening, my ears straining for another sound. When nothing came, I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me and went back to sleep. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, it was louder. I lay in bed, my heart thudding in my chest. My first instinct was to ignore it. Maybe it was some drunk neighbor mistaking my door for theirs. But the knocking continued, and after what felt like forever, I finally gathered the courage to get up. I crept to the door and pressed my eye to the peephole. No one was there, just an empty, dimly lit hallway. I stood there for a while, waiting, but whoever had knocked was long gone. Days passed, and I tried to push the incident out of my mind. But then I started noticing the man across the hall. He wasn't there when I first moved in. He arrived shortly after the knocking began. I'd see him sometimes when I left for work or came home late at night. He was tall and thin, with a blank expression that made it hard to guess his mood. He never spoke to anyone, not even a nod of acknowledgement when we crossed paths. But what really unnerved me was that I often saw him standing outside his apartment late at night. Not doing anything, just standing there, and always in the same spot, facing my door. I started locking my door religiously. Every time I saw him, my stomach twisted with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was overreacting. But the knocks persisted, and every time I heard them, that same feeling would return. The same creeping unease that I wasn't alone. I mentioned it to a friend once. He laughed and told me it was probably nothing, that it could be anything from wind rattling the door to some bored kid playing a prank. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew something was off. One night, the knocking came again. This time it was different, more urgent, like whoever was on the other side wanted me to answer, needed me to. I froze in bed, barely breathing. I didn't move, didn't dare make a sound. The knocks stopped, but I lay awake for hours, too afraid to fall asleep. That was the breaking point for me. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I didn't care if I was being irrational. I just couldn't live like that anymore. The constant anxiety, the sleepless nights, the strange man across the hall. It was all too much. I found a unit on a different floor, far from him, far from that door. Since I moved, the knocking hasn't followed me. I haven't seen the man either. It's quieter here, and I feel safer. But sometimes, late at night, I still catch myself listening for it. That faint, persistent knocking, wondering if it was ever real at all. For weeks, I couldn't sleep properly. Every night, just as I was about to drift off, I would hear strange sounds in the apartment. At first, it was soft, like creaking floorboards or the wind pushing against the windows. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the building settling or noises from the neighbors. But as the nights went on, the sounds got louder. Footsteps, shuffling, and sometimes what sounded like a door closing softly somewhere in the house. I live alone, so naturally, it started to mess with my head. I would lie there in the dark, listening, my mind racing. Every little noise seemed amplified. I would hold my breath, hoping to hear nothing more, but the sounds never stopped. It was like someone was moving around in the apartment, slowly, deliberately. At first, I tried to explain it away. Maybe it was the heating system, or maybe the old pipes were making weird noises. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The footsteps weren't random. They had a pattern to them, like someone pacing back and forth in another room. It was too specific to be just the house settling. One night, I had enough. The sounds were louder than ever, and I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way through the apartment, checking every room. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking, but I needed to know. I needed to see that no one was there. Of course, the place was empty. No sign of anyone, no open windows, nothing out of place. I felt stupid for even checking. I went back to bed, telling myself it was all in my head. But the anxiety didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. Every night, I'd lie awake tense, waiting for the sounds to start again. Then one night, everything changed. It was around 2 a.m. I was lying in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. This time, the sound wasn't inside the apartment. It was outside. I got up quietly and peeked through the blinds, expecting to see nothing. But there in the yard was a man I didn't recognize. He was standing near the back gate, looking directly at my house. I froze. My heart felt like it had stopped. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring. I couldn't make out his face in the darkness, but the way he stood so still sent chills down my spine. For a few minutes, I watched him, too scared to move. I didn't know what to do. Should I call someone? Should I try to confront him? Then, as suddenly as he appeared, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. I stayed by the window, watching the empty yard for what felt like hours. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Who was that man? Had he been coming to my yard before? Was he the one causing all the strange noises? I didn't have any answers, but I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong, and I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. I called a friend to stay with me for a few nights, and I started locking every door and window as soon as the sun went down. The strange sounds haven't stopped completely, but now I'm prepared. I don't know what's going on in my home, but I'm not going to ignore it any longer. I don't feel safe, and until I figure out what's happening, I don't think I ever will. It started with footsteps, just a faint sound at first, like someone lightly walking across the floor. I brushed it off, thinking it must be the neighbors or maybe the building itself settling. But as the nights went on, the footsteps became more distinct, more deliberate. And they weren't just in one place, they seemed to move from room to room. I live alone, so every little noise made my skin crawl. I'd lie in bed, eyes wide open, listening. The footsteps would start and stop, sometimes pacing, sometimes standing still for what felt like minutes. I'd tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The footsteps were closer, louder, like they were coming from right outside my bedroom door. My heart was racing, and every muscle in my body was tense. I grabbed my phone and opened the flashlight app, my hand shaking. Slowly, I got up, tiptoeing to the door. I stood there for a moment, listening, my breath shallow. The apartment was silent now. I opened the door, and my flashlight swept across the room. Nothing. The living room was empty, just as I'd left it. I walked through the apartment, checking each room, but there was no one there. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checked every lock, and went back to bed. But sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about those footsteps, how real they had sounded. Was it just the building making noises? Was I imagining it? For a few nights, things were quiet. I tried to push the whole thing out of my mind. Maybe I was just overworked, I told myself. Maybe the stress was getting to me. But the peace didn't last long. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard something new. A soft creak, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. My heart dropped. I tried to calm myself down, convincing myself it was just the old wood shifting. But then I heard it again. And then the footsteps returned. This time they were slow, almost careful. They moved from the hallway to the living room, and then, terrifyingly, toward my bedroom door. I sat up, my mind racing with fear. Was someone inside my apartment? How had they gotten in? I didn't have any answers, but the fear was real, and it was overwhelming. I didn't want to get up, but I knew I couldn't just sit there. I reached for my phone again, clutching it like a lifeline. I crept to the door, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I stood there, listening, waiting for the footsteps to come again. But they didn't. It was dead quiet, the kind of silence that feels too thick, too still. I forced myself to open the door and looked around. The hallway was empty. The living room was just as I'd left it. There was no sign of anyone, no sign that anything had been disturbed. But the feeling of dread was still there, sitting heavy in my chest. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening, waiting. The sounds didn't come back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That I wasn't alone. The paranoia stuck with me, even during the day. Every time I came home, I would check the locks, the windows, every corner of the apartment. I still don't know what caused those sounds, whether it was something real or just my mind playing tricks on me. But ever since that night, I haven't been able to sleep the same. I'm always listening for footsteps in the dark, always waiting for that sound to return.